Imagine being the boss of a thriving company, thinking everything is running smoothly until one day, you decide to go undercover in your own business. What he discovers is shocking. One worker's heartbreaking confession leaves him speechless. And it's about something he never expected. Why is she skipping lunch? You won't believe the truth he uncovers next. Stick around to find out what happens when the boss sees his company from a completely different angle. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. As the founder and CEO of a popular sandwich chain, James Walker had built his company from the ground up. From a single storefront to hundreds nationwide, the business had flourished, and profits had steadily risen year after year. But lately, something felt off. James, though surrounded by success, had begun receiving troubling reports, discrepancies in financial statements, employee dissatisfaction, and whispers of a problem brewing beneath the surface. The numbers on paper looked good, but something wasn't right. James had always prided himself on being hands-on, understanding every aspect of his business. But lately, the higher he climbed, the less connected he felt with the reality of his employees' lives. He often sat in his sleek office, overlooking the city, wondering if the foundation of his empire was as solid as it seemed. His latest reports from store managers hadn't helped matters. They were glowing. Of course, they had to be, but there was a sense that he was only being told what he wanted to hear. One day, driven by an unsettling gut feeling, James made a decision that would change everything. He decided to experience the business from the ground level, where the real action happened. He would visit one of his stores, but he wouldn't go as the CEO. This time, he'd walk in as a regular customer. He pulled on a simple jacket, left the suit and tie behind, and made his way to a nearby branch. Blending in with the lunch rush, James sat at a corner table, his eyes scanning the room, carefully observing. The smell of fresh bread and grilled meats filled the air, but the hustle and bustle of the lunch hour couldn't mask the unease he felt. The energy seemed off, but he couldn't quite pinpoint why. As he waited for his sandwich, he overheard a conversation between two young women working the counter. One of them, Sarah, was speaking in a quiet voice, almost as if she didn't want anyone to hear. "I'm going to skip lunch again," Sarah said, her words barely above a whisper. "I just don't have enough money today. It's been like this for weeks." Her coworker, Jenny, looked at her in disbelief. "But you're working full-time, right? You shouldn't have to do that." Sarah sighed, her eyes downcast. "The pay isn't enough, Jenny, and I can't even get a break to eat most days. The hours don't leave room for anything else." James froze. His stomach tightened. This was not the story he had expected to hear. He watched the two women, his mind racing. This wasn't just a small issue, like a few customers being dissatisfied. This was something much bigger, an issue that cut to the very core of his company's values. The employees who were meant to be the heart of his business were struggling to make ends meet, working tirelessly without even the basic ability to feed themselves. James's shock turned to disbelief. How had he missed this? His company, which he had built to serve people, now seemed to be failing the very people who kept it running. The realization hit him hard. The problem wasn't just about the quality of the food or the customer service, it was about fairness. About how his employees were being treated. About how they were paid for their time and hard work. He had built a profitable empire, but it seemed to be built on the suffering of the people who worked for him. As he sat there, lost in thought, the truth began to settle in. This wasn't just an isolated incident, this was a pattern. If this was happening at one store, it was likely happening at others. James had to know the truth. He needed to understand why his employees were so unhappy, and why the company's policies were pushing them to the brink. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear. This was a problem that could no longer be ignored. James Walker sat at his desk, the weight of what he had overheard at the sandwich shop still hanging heavily in the air. His mind was buzzing with questions. How had he missed this? How could his company, built on values of service and care, be failing its employees in such a fundamental way? As the CEO of a thriving business, He had never imagined that something so deeply wrong was happening just beneath the surface. The next morning, James decided that he couldn't just sit idly by and ignore the issues that had come to light. He needed answers. He couldn't allow a system of inequality to continue unchecked. Not when he had the power to make a change. He called his head of HR and instructed them to conduct an independent audit of the wages and benefits for employees across the company. It was time to uncover the truth. A few days later, the results came back. James sat with the report in front of him, his stomach sinking as he read through the findings. It wasn't just the store he had visited that was struggling. Across several locations, employees were facing the same harsh reality. Long hours for minimal pay, struggling to afford basic necessities, and being forced to skip meals in order to get by. It was hard to believe. These were the people who made his business run, and they were barely scraping by. The very employees he had always counted on to keep things moving smoothly were the ones being taken advantage of. James's heart sank as he processed the magnitude of what he was reading. He couldn't help but think about Sarah, the woman he'd overheard at the store, and all the others who were quietly enduring similar struggles. He had always been a leader who prided himself on making decisions that were fair and just. Yet here he was, discovering that his company had created a system that not only failed to support its workers but had actively kept them in poverty. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just a case of a few bad apples. The entire system was flawed, and it ran deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a couple of bad managers or a misunderstanding. It was a fundamental issue with the way the company had been structured. And James knew that if he wanted to preserve his integrity, he had no choice but to act. He sat back in his chair, trying to focus. The problem was clear, but the solution wasn't as simple. The wage disparity, the lack of benefits, the long hours with no proper compensation, it all pointed to one thing: a system of inequality that had been embedded within the company for far too long. And this system was the true villain of the story. Not any one individual, the system itself. The policies that kept wages low and benefits minimal was what needed to change. The system was what had allowed this to happen. Without wasting any more time, James made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit back and let the company continue down this path. The next day, he gathered the leadership team and announced a bold new plan. He would immediately increase wages for all employees, ensuring that no one would have to struggle to make ends meet again. He also introduced a new policy: every employee working a shift would receive a free meal. It wasn't just about the financial relief, it was about showing the team that he valued their hard work and dedication. The announcement sent shockwaves through the office. Employees were shocked, grateful, and emotionally moved by the changes. Some were even brought to tears, realizing that the CEO had taken the time to truly understand their struggles. It was a moment of genuine connection that James hadn't anticipated, and it made him realize how much more needed to be done. But even as James basked in the success of his decision, a nagging feeling lingered in the back of his mind. This was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. The system he had uncovered was far more ingrained than he had initially thought. There were policies, unspoken rules, and practices that had been in place for years, and they couldn't be fixed with a simple raise. James knew that he had to dig deeper, to address the very foundation of the company's culture, and find a way to make the change stick. As he sat in his office, looking out over the city, James couldn't shake the thought that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The decisions he made now would define not just the future of his company, but the lives of the people who worked for it. He had made his move, but the real work was only just starting. After the bold decision to increase wages and provide free meals for employees, James felt a small sense of relief. It was the right thing to do, but he knew deep down that it was only a beginning. The surface had barely been scratched, and he wasn't about to let the company he had built rest on a quick fix. The issues within the workforce ran deeper than what he had seen in the first store he visited. He needed to continue digging, to understand the full extent of the problem that had been hidden for so long. In the following days, James embarked on a more extensive investigation into the company's wage structure and employee benefits. He traveled to several of the company's branches, meeting with employees from all levels. He wasn't just looking for reports from the managers anymore, he wanted to hear directly from the workers. The ones who felt the effects of the company's policies every single day. He started holding casual conversations with staff members, making sure they understood that he was there to listen, not to judge. As James gathered information, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The disparity between what was reported in the financial records and what employees were experiencing was staggering. On paper, the company was thriving, the numbers were up, and the projections were optimistic. But in reality, employees were working long, grueling hours, often without proper compensation for overtime. Many spoke of the pressure to work unpaid extra hours, and the lack of proper benefits made their already difficult jobs even harder. James began to see the stark contrast between the polished image of his company and the harsh reality his employees were facing. One particular conversation stood out to him. At a branch in downtown Seattle, he met with Emma, a longtime employee who had been with the company for over a decade. Emma was in her mid-30s, a mother of two, and had dedicated years of her life to the company. When James asked her about the changes he'd made, she seemed grateful but cautious. "It's a step in the right direction, but there's more to it," she said quietly, looking over her shoulder as though making sure no one else was listening. Emma went on to explain how, over the years, the company's policies had shifted. "The pay just isn't enough for a lot of us," she told him. "But what's worse is that we're expected to stay late, to help out, to pick up extra shifts. But those hours? They don't get paid. It's like they expect us to just give our time away. For free." She paused, her eyes growing somber. "And if you say no, you're seen as uncooperative, lazy even." James was taken aback. He had never realized how far-reaching the issue was. As Emma continued to share her experiences, James realized the full scale of the problem. It wasn't just about a few disgruntled employees, it was systemic. The company's overtime policies had effectively become a way to squeeze more from employees without compensating them fairly. The lack of support and the unrealistic expectations were suffocating. He could see how this practice could easily go unnoticed by someone who wasn't working on the ground. He made a mental note of Emma's words, thankful that she had been willing to speak out. She wasn't the only one. As James continued his journey, he found that these same issues were being echoed at almost every store he visited. The culture of expecting unpaid overtime was ingrained in the company's structure. And it wasn't just damaging employees' finances, it was eroding the very foundation of the company's integrity. But just as James felt he was starting to piece the puzzle together, something unexpected happened. As he returned to his office and began reviewing the materials Emma and others had given him, he realized that a crucial batch of documents had disappeared. Key files that outlined overtime hours and wage records had been wiped clean from the system. His heart raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. He called in his IT team, but they couldn't offer a reasonable explanation. The files were gone, and no one seemed to know why. In the midst of this, Emma abruptly stopped responding to his calls. When he finally managed to track her down, she sounded tense on the other end of the line. "I can't do this anymore," she told him, her voice shaking. "I'm scared. I've been threatened. I can't afford to lose my job." James could hear the distress in her voice, and it hit him like a punch to the stomach. The system was fighting back. It wasn't just the policies that were corrupt, it was the people who had been benefiting from those policies. The ones in power who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. James was now facing a new reality. The forces behind this corruption weren't just passive, they were actively trying to cover their tracks. The people he had trusted to help him uncover the truth were being silenced. And the deeper he dug, the more resistance he encountered. Emma's sudden withdrawal from the investigation was a red flag that something much bigger was at play. He could no longer afford to trust that the system would work for him. He had to outsmart the very forces that were trying to bury the truth. The pressure mounted as James sat in his office late into the night. Staring at the blank screen before him, he could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on him. But he refused to back down. The company might be trying to hide its darkest secrets, but James was more determined than ever to bring them into the light. James Walker sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of the investigation pressing heavily on his chest. It had been weeks since he'd discovered the hidden issues with his company's wage policies. The more he dug, the clearer it became that what he'd uncovered wasn't just a series of isolated problems, it was a systemic failure. But as he continued to peel back the layers, something else was emerging from the shadows. Something far more dangerous. It wasn't just the employees on the front lines struggling. The real culprits seemed to be at the very top of the company. It started with the financial reports. For weeks, James had been reviewing them closely, trying to make sense of the discrepancies. The numbers didn't add up, and he couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was covering their tracks. His suspicions soon turned toward Christopher Thomas, the head of the company's finance department. Christopher had always been a trusted member of the leadership team, someone who, on paper, had helped steer the company toward its impressive growth. But now, James began to see him in a different light. The signs were subtle at first: small discrepancies, missing documentation, and gaps in the financial records. But as James dug deeper, it became clear that Christopher was at the heart of it all. Christopher had managed to gain a tight grip on the company's financial decisions. But it was becoming evident that he wasn't just safeguarding the company's wealth. He was manipulating it, funneling profits in a way that ensured those at the top, including himself, reaped the rewards while the employees bore the brunt of the financial imbalance. James couldn't help but feel betrayed. Christopher wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was a part of the system that was actively causing harm to the company's culture and its workers. One afternoon, as James prepared for a routine meeting, he realized it was time for a confrontation. He had the evidence, enough to take action, but what he needed now was a confession. As the meeting room filled, James noticed the familiar, yet unsettling, presence of Christopher sitting at the head of the table. There was a chill in the air, and for the first time, James felt a palpable tension between them. The man who had once been his trusted ally now felt like a complete stranger. The conversation began amicably enough, but James soon steered it toward the financial issues he had uncovered. Christopher's demeanor shifted. He grew defensive, his voice taking on a subtle edge. "James, you're treading on dangerous ground," he warned, "uncovering things you're not prepared to handle. If you keep digging, it won't just hurt the company. It will hurt all of us, especially those close to you." There was a dark undertone to his words, a veiled threat that made James uneasy. He had expected some pushback, but this felt more like a warning. "I'm not here to destroy the company," James replied, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here to make it better. If there's something wrong, we need to fix it. If you have nothing to hide, then why are you so defensive?" Christopher's gaze flickered for just a moment, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. "I'm just saying, sometimes the truth isn't as clear-cut as you think. You don't understand the bigger picture, James. There are things at play here that go beyond simple accounting." James felt the weight of those words settle over him like a heavy blanket. There was more, much more, and for the first time, he realized that the financial manipulation he had uncovered was part of something much larger, a web of deceit that reached into the very core of the company's leadership. But he wasn't going to back down now. The twist came when James demanded access to certain confidential financial documents that had been withheld. Christopher hesitated for just a moment before reluctantly handing over a set of files. As James flipped through them, a sickening realization gripped him. The documents had been altered, key figures had been changed, expenses hidden, and profits inflated. It was as though someone had meticulously tailored the records to create a narrative that would shield the company's leadership from any scrutiny. But this wasn't just a cover-up, it was a deliberate act to maintain power and control. "This isn't just about the wages," James muttered to himself, his mind racing. "This is about control, about keeping everything under wraps, no matter the cost." The documents laid bare the extent of Christopher's manipulation. It wasn't just about underpaying employees and taking advantage of them. It was about a deeper financial strategy that funneled resources away from those who truly needed them. The decisions made in the higher echelons of the company weren't being guided by fairness or ethical standards. They were being made to benefit a select few at the top. James stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he held the documents in his hands. "This ends now," he said, more to himself than to anyone in the room. He wasn't sure how he was going to confront this head-on. But he knew one thing. It was no longer just about the employees. It was about the very soul of his company, and he would not let it be destroyed by greed and manipulation. As the meeting came to a close, James locked eyes with Christopher one last time. The threat was clear. The manipulation was vast, but James had made up his mind. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. James had reached the tipping point. There was no turning back now. For weeks, he had carefully uncovered the layers of deception and manipulation that had been allowed to thrive in his company. He could no longer pretend that things would resolve themselves. The truth needed to be confronted, and the guilty parties had to be held accountable. The meeting had been scheduled, and today, he was going to face Christopher Thomas head-on. It was time to bring the battle into the open. The room was cold, the air thick with tension as the leaders of the company gathered around the table. James could feel the weight of the moment on his shoulders. He had hoped that this meeting would mark the beginning of a much-needed change. But deep down, he knew that Christopher would fight back with everything he had. The financial manipulations, the distorted reports, and the exploitation of the employees, all of it had led to this confrontation. James stood firm, his eyes locked on Christopher, who was sitting across from him, flanked by a few of his loyal allies. "James, I see you're still determined to dig into matters that don't concern you," Christopher began, his voice smooth but laced with an undertone of threat. "I thought you were a man of reason. But this is a war you won't win. You're digging too deep into a system that's been in place for years." James's hands rested on the table, his fingers curling into fists. But he didn't flinch. "This is no longer about a system," James responded, his tone calm but unwavering. "This is about truth and fairness. And what I've uncovered doesn't just concern the company's books. It's about the way people are treated." "How long were you planning to keep this hidden?" Christopher's expression tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. "You think this is just about the numbers?" he sneered. "You're naive. If you expose this, you'll bring down the company. It's not just about the employees, it's about the investors, the partners, and everyone who trusts us. You risk ruining everything. You'll destroy your own reputation along with it." There was a brief pause, a silence that stretched like a rubber band, ready to snap. James could feel the pressure building, but he refused to let it sway him. Christopher was attempting to intimidate him, to force him into silence with threats veiled as warnings. But James wouldn't back down. "Not now. I'm not backing away from this, Christopher," James said firmly, "and I'm not doing it for myself either. This is for the people who have been mistreated, for the employees who've been exploited by your system. This ends today." Christopher's lips curled into a smirk, but there was a flicker of something else behind his eyes, fear. James could see it now. As much as Christopher tried to project confidence, the man was rattled. This wasn't just a financial issue, it was a power struggle. And James was finally standing up to him. As the meeting continued, it became clear that Christopher wasn't going to take responsibility for the manipulation that had been taking place under his watch. Instead, he deflected, placing blame on lower-level employees for not adhering to company policies or misunderstanding the financial guidelines. His ability to shift blame so easily only made James more determined. Christopher had built a web of lies, and James was hell-bent on unweaving it. The tension in the room was palpable as James presented the evidence he had gathered. He laid out the documents, the altered financial reports, and the emails from employees confirming the pressure to work overtime without proper compensation. Christopher's face grew darker with every piece of evidence that was revealed. But instead of confessing, Christopher tried to downplay everything, turning the conversation toward potential damage control. "We can fix this, James," Christopher said, leaning forward slightly, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "I can make it go away. We can smooth things over. But we need to be careful. If you pursue this path, there will be no turning back." James saw through his words, recognizing the threat disguised as an offer of peace. He didn't flinch. "There's nothing to fix, Christopher. There's only one path forward, accountability. And that starts now." But just as James thought he was closing in on his victory, the unexpected happened. One of his key allies, a longtime employee who had been providing crucial information, C4, suddenly withdrew from the investigation. James was blindsided when he learned that the employee had been threatened, coerced into silence by an unknown figure within the company. The news hit James like a punch to the gut. The corruption ran deeper than he had realized. It wasn't just about Christopher, it was about a network of people, hidden in plain sight, Who had a vested interest in keeping the status quo intact? The betrayal stung, but it also fueled James's resolve. He knew now that the fight was much bigger than just uncovering financial fraud. It was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed such practices to thrive in the first place. He had to move faster, think smarter, and find new allies who weren't afraid to face the truth. "All right," James said, standing up, his voice steady. "I can see where this is going. But don't think for a second that I'll let this slide. You've underestimated me, Christopher. This fight is just getting started." Christopher's expression hardened, and for a moment, their eyes locked in an unspoken challenge. The battle for control was far from over, but James was more determined than ever to bring the truth to light. No matter what it took. James had made up his mind. The gloves were off. He could no longer sit back and allow the deep-rooted corruption in his company to continue unchecked. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Christopher Thomas, the head of finance, and his loyal supporters were determined to keep the truth buried. But James wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not after everything he had discovered. It was time to take action. And he wasn't going to rely on internal procedures anymore. He needed to fight fire with fire. He began devising a bold new plan, one that would expose the truth for all to see. It wouldn't just be a matter of revealing what had been hidden behind closed doors. It would be about bringing the battle to the public eye. The media had to be involved. James knew the power of the press. If he could get the story out there, it would not only force the company to confront its corruption, but it would also shift the balance of power. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, people who were equally committed to exposing the truth and were willing to stand beside him. Regardless of the consequences, he began assembling a team of powerful allies, top lawyers, investigative journalists, and people who had experience in corporate whistleblowing. Together, they would take on the company's leaders. James's plan wasn't just about legal action, it was about creating a public outcry that would put immense pressure on the company to change. He reached out to key reporters from major news outlets, some of whom had worked on corporate fraud cases before. They agreed to help him get the story out. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and there was a real risk involved. But James was prepared to do whatever it took to fix what had gone wrong. Meanwhile, Christopher wasn't about to let James's investigation go unchallenged. He knew his grip on the company was slipping, and he was desperate to retain control. Christopher was a master of manipulation, and he quickly began using psychological tactics to intimidate and divide James's allies. He called in favors from his powerful contacts in the media and the business world, threatening to destroy James's reputation if he continued to press the issue. He used his influence to spread rumors, painting James as a troublemaker who was destabilizing the company. At the same time, Christopher ordered several employees to continue covering up the financial discrepancies. Important evidence, the very documents that James was relying on to expose the truth, mysteriously disappeared or were altered. Every move James made was countered with a calculated response from Christopher's camp. It was clear that the fight was going to be more complicated than James had anticipated. The company's problems were far deeper than just financial mismanagement. There were powerful forces at play, determined to keep things as they were. James's determination, however, never wavered. He knew the truth couldn't be silenced forever, and he refused to back down. With the help of his team, he began to push harder, making connections with influential figures in the media and getting his story into the public eye. As news outlets began to pick up the story, more employees from within the company came forward, confirming James's findings and speaking out about the exploitation they had endured for years. But just as it seemed like the momentum was building, a twist occurred that sent shockwaves through the entire operation. During a critical press conference where James was about to speak publicly about the corruption, a key employee, a trusted ally who had been providing crucial inside information, suddenly stepped forward and revealed something that James had not expected. "I can't stay silent anymore," the employee said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We were all threatened. We were forced to participate in the manipulation. And we were told to stay quiet. Or else. I was afraid for my job. My family." The room fell silent as the employee continued. "We were told not to speak out. That our careers would be ruined if we did. But what they did, what they forced us to do, isn't right. It's time the truth came out." James's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But it was also the moment he feared most. The information this employee had revealed was both validating and devastating. Christopher's tactics weren't just confined to financial manipulation. They had extended into outright intimidation and coercion. The employee's bravery was the tipping point. And suddenly, the full scope of the problem was laid bare. The impact of the revelation was immediate. The media, now armed with this new testimony, erupted into a frenzy. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. No longer was James the lone whistleblower. Now, he had a growing army of supporters, all eager to see the corrupt system dismantled. The spotlight was on Christopher and the company's leadership, and the pressure mounted. James could see the walls closing in on them. Christopher, who had once exuded confidence, now seemed cornered. He couldn't hide from the truth any longer. And with the mounting public scrutiny, his ability to manipulate the narrative was quickly slipping away. The truth had gained too much traction, and the company's carefully constructed image was starting to crumble. For James, this was just the beginning. He had started a wave of change, but the battle was far from over. The forces that had once been in control were now on the defensive. But the true challenge would be breaking down the system that had allowed their actions to continue for so long. The fight for justice, for transparency, and for the future of his company had just entered its most dangerous phase. The grand event was set to take place in just a few days. And the tension in the air was almost palpable. Christopher Thomas had planned it meticulously, a public ceremony to solidify his control over the company. To make sure that everything James had uncovered would be buried, once and for all. The invitation list included investors, media outlets, and key partners. It was to be a spectacle, a show of strength and unity to rebuild the company's image after the scandal. Christopher's goal was simple: convince everyone that the allegations of financial manipulation were nothing more than misunderstandings, a product of miscommunication, and a few disgruntled employees. James knew the stakes. If Christopher succeeded in using this event to rally support, the battle would be lost. But James wasn't one to back down. He had spent too much time uncovering the truth, too many sleepless nights gathering evidence. This wasn't just about saving face, it was about bringing justice to the people who had been wronged by the very system that had allowed Christopher's power to grow unchecked. James knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let this event go unchallenged. In a bold move, he and his team decided to turn the tables on Christopher. Instead of sitting back and letting the media cover the event as a victory for the corrupt system, James would use the very platform Christopher had created to expose the truth. He had arranged for a live television interview, where he would reveal key documents, financial records, testimonies, and the secret deals that had been kept under wraps. The world would see the real story, and James was ready to make sure the truth came to light. On the night before the event, James felt a sense of urgency like never before. He wasn't just fighting for the company anymore, he was fighting for everything that he believed in. He couldn't let Christopher's manipulation and lies continue any longer. The time had come for action. With his allies, including Emma and Sarah, by his side, he prepared for the confrontation. But just as James was about to get his team into position, a shocking twist unfolded. In the final hours leading up to the interview, one of his key allies, Sarah, suddenly turned on him. Sarah had been one of the strongest voices in the investigation, a whistleblower who had worked with James to gather evidence. She had been the one to help him connect the dots, to expose Christopher's financial manipulation. But now, she was nowhere to be found. James received a call late at night. Sarah, her voice trembling, told him that she couldn't go through with it. "I've been threatened," she confessed, the words coming out in a rush. "They told me if I testify against Christopher, my career will be over. They promised to protect me if I just walked away." The betrayal hit James like a cold wind. He knew the risks of taking on such powerful opponents, but he hadn't expected one of his own team to be swayed by fear. For a moment, James was paralyzed. How could Sarah, someone he had trusted, have turned her back on him? But there was no time to dwell on it. He had already come so far, and the fight for justice was bigger than any one person. He had to push forward. The morning of the event, James walked into the television studio with his head held high. He had learned from Sarah's betrayal, and now, More than ever, he knew that the stakes had grown even higher. The interview was set to be broadcast live, and it was his chance to expose Christopher for the manipulator he was. The pressure was immense, but James had no choice but to carry on. As the cameras rolled and the interview began, James laid out the evidence, piece by piece, the financial records, the emails, the testimonies from employees who had been afraid to speak out. The truth was undeniable. Christopher's empire was built on lies, and James was going to make sure the world knew it. The public would finally understand the lengths to which Christopher had gone to maintain his grip on power. The manipulations that had been hidden for so long. But just as James thought he had everything under control, another twist emerged, a last-minute revelation from one of his remaining allies. C6 had left the entire operation in jeopardy. C6, a former senior manager who had once worked closely with Christopher, had stepped forward with new information that cast doubt on the validity of the evidence James had so carefully prepared. C6 claimed that certain documents James had relied on were doctored, possibly planted to mislead him. The credibility of James's entire case was suddenly under attack. The room seemed to close in on him. How could this happen now? When they were so close to exposing the truth, James felt his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. This was a game of power, and Christopher had just leveled the playing field. For a brief moment, it seemed as though everything James had worked for was slipping away. But then, the memory of the workers he had met, of Sarah's courage and Emma's quiet strength, flooded his mind. He couldn't give up now. He had come this far, and he would not be stopped by one more betrayal. The truth would out, no matter the cost. With renewed determination, James regrouped with C6 and his remaining allies. They went back to the drawing board, rechecking every document, recalculating every piece of evidence. The fight was far from over, but as the pressure mounted and the walls seemed to close in, James knew that he had only one choice: to press forward and finish what he had started. The truth had to come to light, and he was the one who would ensure it did. The betrayal had stung harder than James expected. Sarah, once one of his strongest allies, had turned her back on him just when the fight seemed to be reaching its climax. It was a move that could have shattered his confidence. But James wasn't the type to crumble under pressure. Instead, he took a deep breath and focused. He had no time to dwell on Sarah's decision. The battle was far from over, and he was determined to see it through to the end. In the days following Sarah's defection, James made a bold decision. Instead of confronting Christopher directly at the grand event, where the media and the board of directors would be watching, he decided to hijack the spotlight in his own way. It would be a public spectacle of his own making, one where the truth could no longer be ignored. He called for an impromptu press conference, one that would include lawyers, journalists, and all the necessary parties to expose the corruption and manipulation that had been running rampant in his company. This wasn't just about presenting evidence, it was about taking back control of the narrative. He wasn't going to allow Christopher to use the company's public event to whitewash everything they had uncovered. As the press conference approached, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The air was thick with tension as James and his remaining allies prepared for the confrontation. The media outlets were buzzing with anticipation, eager to hear what James had to say after weeks of rumors and whispers. Inside, James was calm, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the moment of truth. There was no turning back. The conference began with a flurry of flashes from cameras, and James took his place at the podium. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and, for some, excitement. With a deep breath, he began to speak. His voice was steady as he outlined the events that had led to this point: the manipulation of financial records, the exploitation of employees, and the systemic issues that had been buried for far too long. He spoke candidly about the company's corruption, naming Christopher and his accomplices, and revealing the damning evidence that had been gathered over the past few weeks. As he presented the files, the room was silent, save for the occasional murmur of disbelief. The documents were irrefutable, the facts clear. Christopher's efforts to hide the truth were crumbling before him. But just when it seemed like the tide had fully turned in James's favor, a shocking twist hit the room. Out of nowhere, one of James's former allies, C6, a key insider in the company's operations, stood up and began to speak. At first, her voice trembled, but with each word, it grew steadier, more determined. "There's more," she said, drawing the attention of every person in the room. "What James has uncovered is just the beginning. Christopher's manipulation goes far deeper than anyone realized." James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He hadn't anticipated this. He knew C6 had been a trusted ally. But now, she was bringing forward new revelations, ones that had never been discussed. C6 went on to explain that Christopher wasn't simply manipulating the company's financial reports. He had a much larger plan to control key investments, fund secret projects, and alter the very structure of the business itself. This was no longer just about finances. It was a full-scale conspiracy that involved high-level manipulation and strategic positioning, aimed at maintaining Christopher's hold over the entire company. The room erupted in shock. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was the smoking gun, the final piece of the puzzle that had eluded him for so long. The information C6 revealed was explosive, a detailed strategy laid out by Christopher to hijack the company's future, ensuring that his power would remain unchallenged. It was a game changer. Now, the truth had truly been laid bare for the world to see. The public was stunned, and the media was in overdrive, covering every detail as the story unfolded. The authorities were quick to respond. With the new evidence in hand, law enforcement and regulatory bodies immediately began their investigation into Christopher's actions and those who had assisted him in orchestrating the financial fraud. James watched as the weight of justice began to fall on those who had abused their power. Christopher and his co-conspirators were arrested, their once unshakable control over the company crumbling. James could feel a sense of victory rising within him. They had won. The truth had prevailed. But as the dust began to settle, James knew that the victory, while sweet, was not the end. The company was in turmoil, and the damage done to its reputation was profound. While the perpetrators were being held accountable, James understood that this was just the beginning of the real work. The company's management structure needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. The trust that had been lost needed to be regained. And most importantly, the culture of fear and exploitation needed to be replaced with one of fairness and transparency. As James sat in the quiet of his office that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The battle for justice had been long and hard, but it had forged him into a stronger leader, one who would never again allow such corruption to go unchecked. There was much work to be done, but now, with the truth exposed, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would rebuild his company, not just as a business, but as a symbol of integrity and fairness. The road ahead was still uncertain, but James was ready. He had faced the darkness, and now it was time to step into the light. James had thought the worst was behind him. After Christopher Thomas and his accomplices were arrested, he allowed himself a brief moment of triumph. The corruption that had festered within his company for so long was finally coming to light. The press conference had gone as planned. The media was buzzing, and the public was beginning to understand the depth of the manipulation. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. He believed that the battle for justice was over, that the corrupt system was being dismantled, and that the road to recovery had finally begun. But as the investigation continued, something happened that shook him to his core. The authorities, as they dug deeper into the company's financial dealings, discovered that Christopher wasn't the only one involved in the widespread manipulation. A new name surfaced, one that James had never suspected: Catherine Harris, a close confidant from within his own ranks. Catherine, the very woman who had helped him build the company's financial strategy, had been an integral part of the conspiracy. She wasn't just a passive player. She had been actively hiding the truth from James and enabling the manipulation of funds for years. The revelation hit James like a brick. Catherine, who had been his trusted ally, his right hand, was just as guilty as Christopher. Not only had she been involved in the financial cover-up, but she had also used her close relationship with James to shield the company's wrongdoing. It felt like a gut punch, the kind of betrayal that James had never expected from someone so close. His mind raced, trying to piece together the truth of it all. How had he missed this? How had he trusted someone who had been undermining him from the very beginning? The realization that Catherine had been complicit for so long left him feeling lost. He had been betrayed by someone he had considered not just a colleague, but a friend. The confrontation with Catherine was inevitable. James called her into his office, steeling himself for what was sure to be an emotional encounter. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as soon as Catherine entered the room, he knew that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Her face was pale, her eyes avoiding his gaze, and for the first time, James saw her for what she truly was. Someone who had been hiding behind a mask of trust and loyalty, only to reveal her true colors when it was too late. "Catherine," James began, his voice tight, "I never thought I'd be sitting here, confronting you about this. I thought you were with me, that you were helping me fix what had gone wrong. But now I find out that you've been part of the very system I've been fighting against." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her voice trembling. "James, I never wanted this. I didn't want to betray you. But I didn't have a choice. Christopher, he threatened me. He said if I didn't help him, I'd lose everything. My job, my future, everything. I was scared, and I didn't know how to get out." James felt his anger rise. "You could have come to me, Catherine. We could have worked through this together. You didn't have to be part of this. You chose to stand with them. And now look where we are." The words stung, but James knew they had to be said. The betrayal, however justified it might have seemed to her at the time, could not be excused. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't just Christopher. There were others, people in the company who were all in on it. I was alone. James, I didn't think you would believe me if I came to you with the truth. I thought it was too big, too dangerous." James stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he paced the room. The weight of the conversation was suffocating. He had trusted her, and now, the very foundation of his trust had crumbled. "I've given everything for this company. Catherine, you've watched me work day in and day out, trying to build something good, something honest. And now, to know that you've been hiding all of this from me, it's more than I can take." Catherine's face crumpled, her tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, James. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was scared. Please, you have to understand." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. James was torn. His heart ached for the woman he had trusted, but his mind told him there was no room for weakness. The company needed a clean slate, and it needed to start with him. "Sarah betrayed me, and now you've done the same. I can't trust anyone anymore. Catherine, not like this." James's voice was cold now, a hard edge settling in. "You've done irreparable damage. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what, and you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." Just as James thought the situation couldn't get worse, another shock hit him. As he sat back down, a call came through from his legal team. They had found a critical document that had been missing for days. It was one of the key pieces of evidence that had been locked away in the archives of the company's financial records. James was about to breathe a sigh of relief when he realized something terrifying. The document didn't just expose more financial discrepancies, it revealed a larger, far more sinister conspiracy that James had never even imagined. The document detailed a plan to funnel company assets into secret offshore accounts, hidden under layers of false investments. This wasn't just about manipulating wages or financial statements, it was about something far more elaborate. A global scheme designed to steal and launder money on a massive scale. It was an operation that had extended beyond just Christopher. Beyond Catherine, there were others. High-ranking individuals still lurking in the shadows. James's heart sank as he processed this new information. The fight he thought he had won was far from over. The forces at play were deeper and more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. And now, it was no longer just about restoring fairness within the company. It was about exposing a global conspiracy and taking down an empire built on lies and corruption. James stood by the window of his office, gazing out at the city below. The skyline was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, a reminder of how far he had come. His company, once on the brink of collapse, was slowly beginning to recover. The road ahead was still long, but after all the battles he had fought, the betrayals, the manipulations, the countless sleepless nights, the sense of victory was sweet. even if it was only the beginning. The changes he had implemented were already taking root. The pay raises, the improved benefits, and the new policies that fostered a fairer and more respectful workplace were making a noticeable difference. Employees, once disengaged and disillusioned, were beginning to feel seen again. Their morale had skyrocketed. No longer were they just cogs in a machine, they were valued. And that made all the difference. The workplace atmosphere, which had been riddled with tension, had begun to shift. Laughter could be heard again in the break rooms, and the conversations were no longer filled with whispers of discontent. There was a new sense of pride that had taken hold among the employees. And James felt an overwhelming sense of pride too, knowing he had been the catalyst for this positive change. But he knew this was only one step in a much larger journey. The culture shift had begun, but it needed to be maintained. There was still a long way to go. His commitment to restructuring the company, not just in terms of policy but also in terms of values, had only just begun. The leadership team, many of whom had been complicit in the previous system, needed to be held accountable. And even though James had successfully eliminated the corrupt forces within the company, he knew that he had to rebuild the very framework of the organization if he wanted lasting change. This wasn't just about taking down the bad actors, it was about making sure the system they had used couldn't rise again. A week later, James found himself standing before the company's board of directors. The stakes could not have been higher. This was the final step in the journey to fully reform the company. He was about to present his new, comprehensive plan for the future, one that included full transparency in financial dealings, a restructuring of leadership, and an overhaul of internal policies that would prevent the kind of exploitation that had poisoned the company for so long. It was a tense moment, but James was ready. His words were clear and unwavering as he explained his vision for the company's future. He made it clear that the changes were non-negotiable. "We are at a crossroads," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "If we are to move forward, it's imperative that we rebuild this company from the ground up. It's no longer just about profits or growth. It's about fairness, trust, and transparency. These are the principles that will guide us from now on." The board members, many of whom had been skeptical of James's leadership in the past, were visibly moved. They could see the passion and conviction in his eyes. And for the first time in a long while, they could feel the weight of the company's future resting on their shoulders. It wasn't just a business decision anymore, it was a moral one. The decision was made, and James's reforms were approved. It felt like a personal victory, but also a victory for everyone who had been silenced for so long. But as James left the boardroom, a lingering thought gnawed at the back of his mind. This victory, while significant, was far from the end of the battle. The company had been revived, yes, but the true test was yet to come. There was something he hadn't expected, a new threat, one that came from within the ranks of the board members themselves. It came to light through an unexpected source, a report that had been missing from the archives. The document contained details of a new, far-reaching conspiracy, one that involved a faction of the board members who had been conspiring behind the scenes to quietly undermine the reforms James had put in place. This wasn't just about financial manipulation anymore, this was about power. There were people within the company who were attempting to maintain control, quietly building their own faction to subvert the progress that had been made. James's victory over Christopher had been just one battle, and now a new force was rising, a force that would stop at nothing to reclaim the power it had lost. James's heart sank as he processed this new revelation. The conspiracy wasn't over, and the fight for justice was far from finished. There were still those who believed in maintaining the old system, those who were willing to do whatever it took to restore the status quo. This was a new chapter in the war for control, and James realized that he couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. The system had been weakened, but it had not been destroyed. He sat in his office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had fought so hard for this company, for the employees, and for the future, but the road ahead was now filled with uncertainty. James knew that the work he had done was important, but it was only the beginning. There was still a battle to be fought, and this time, it would take everything he had to ensure that the changes he had made would last. As he looked out the window at the bustling city below, James understood one thing. The true fight for justice wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about ensuring that the fight never ended, that the battle for fairness and transparency would continue, no matter the cost. He had set the wheels of change in motion, but now it was up to him to make sure they kept turning. The aftermath of the scandal was swift and unforgiving. Christopher Thomas, along with his key allies within the company, was arrested and charged with a range of criminal activities, corruption, financial fraud, and the abuse of power. The evidence James had painstakingly gathered had been enough to bring down the people who had orchestrated the company's deceitful practices. For once, the system of power that had allowed Christopher and his allies to flourish came crashing down. And justice seemed to have its day. Christopher's arrest was just the beginning. The ripple effects of his actions spread across the company like wildfire. Several top executives and department heads who had been complicit in the cover-up were also implicated. And many were swiftly removed from their positions. Those who had been close to Christopher were now facing legal consequences for their involvement in manipulating company records and suppressing the truth. The company was bleeding leadership, but the rot had to be excised before any healing could begin. For James, there was no sense of triumph, no relief in the punishment of those responsible. Instead, there was a cold, creeping realization that the victory, while significant, was far from complete. The system that had allowed corruption to take root in the first place still existed. The company's structures, its very framework, were deeply flawed, and even though the individuals responsible for its darkest deeds had been ousted, the system itself was still in place. James had taken down the kingpins, but the battle to rebuild and reform had only just begun. The weight of this new realization hit him hard, especially in the wake of everything he had been through. His decisions had cost him friendships, alliances, and trust. He had fought tooth and nail to uncover the truth. But now, with the corruption exposed, he had to face the consequences of his own decisions. The company was being forced to change, but James knew that to truly move forward, he had to confront the flaws within the structure that allowed such corruption to thrive. As if the external pressures weren't enough, James was now faced with an intensely personal decision. His legal team had advised him that, given the political and legal climate, it might be wise to consider cutting a deal with the board of directors, allowing the company to stabilize without further rocking the boat. The offer was tempting. It could provide James with the security of knowing his family and his career were safe. But the deal would come at a cost. It would mean accepting a system that was only half reformed. The deal would preserve his position, but it would also allow certain members of the old guard to remain in power. James found himself in a dilemma, torn between the future of his company and the future of his own peace of mind. Could he walk away from this fight, securing his personal life but potentially leaving the company vulnerable to new forms of corruption? Or should he push for a complete overhaul, risking everything to truly reform the company from the inside out? Every decision felt like it would define the rest of his life. And the pressure weighed heavily on him. He thought about the late-night conversations he had had with Emma and Sarah, the employees who had given him the courage to continue. He thought about the faces of the workers who had suffered in silence for years, all in the name of profits. The temptation to settle, to put an end to the fight for his own sake, was there, but the thought of betraying the trust he had worked so hard to earn, the trust of those who had believed in him, made him uneasy. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, James stood by his office window and looked out over the city. The skyline, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a reminder of everything at stake. He knew that continuing the fight would be difficult, and it would alienate him from those who had supported him. But he also knew that turning away from the fight would be a betrayal of everything he had stood for. His soul demanded more than just a resolution to the company's immediate struggles. He wanted to see a system that worked for the people, not the powerful. The pressure was immense. James had to make his decision soon. The board was pushing for a conclusion, and the future of the company hung in the balance. The internal conflicts were escalating, and the growing divide between the board and the employees threatened to tear the company apart. James had one final chance to make things right, but it would take all his strength, and more, to overcome the forces that were determined to protect the old order. In the next critical meeting with the board, James stood before the men and women who held the future of the company in their hands. He had presented his vision for a new company, one that would be transparent, ethical, and just. He had called for sweeping reforms, a restructuring of the management system, the introduction of stricter checks and balances, and, most importantly, a company-wide commitment to fairness. The response from the board was mixed. Some were on board with the plan, understanding the need for a change. Others, however, pushed back, resistant to the kind of radical shift James was proposing. They saw the reforms as too risky, too costly, and feared it would upset the delicate balance they had worked so hard to maintain. For a brief moment, James thought that perhaps he had been naive in his idealism. Could the company really survive the kind of transformation he was demanding? But then, something unexpected happened. One of the older board members, a man who had been with the company since its early days, spoke up. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "The company needs change. We've been living in the past, and it's time for a new future. We'll back your plan, James, but we need to be realistic about the risks. We can't lose sight of the bigger picture." It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The decision to move forward with the reforms was made, but it wasn't without compromise. There would be no immediate overhauls. Instead, James would lead a gradual transformation, taking steps toward greater transparency and fairness, but with a careful eye on the company's stability. As James left the meeting, he felt a sense of relief, but also a nagging unease. The road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. The system was changing, but it wasn't fixed yet. He had won this battle, but the war for the company's soul was far from over. And as he looked out over the city one more time, he knew that no matter what came next, he was prepared to continue the fight, for the employees, for the company, and for himself. With Christopher and his accomplices now facing justice, James felt a small sense of relief. The company had finally begun to breathe again. But the work was far from over. The victory was hard-earned, but it had come at a great cost. Now, it was time to rebuild, to create a company that stood on principles of fairness and transparency. The changes that were made couldn't just be superficial, they had to be foundational, embedded in every layer of the business. James rolled up his sleeves and set to work. The first step was to overhaul the company's policies, which had long been biased against the employees. Wages were raised to a fair level, benefits were expanded, and the working conditions were improved. James knew that, for real change to take root, the company needed to make its employees feel valued. Every worker, from the lowest-ranking employee to the top managers, had to see that the culture had shifted. The new policies weren't just about fairness in the workplace, they were about establishing trust, creating a sense of belonging, and showing the team that they were the heartbeat of the company. But beyond the financial adjustments, James realized that the company needed a new management structure, one that was transparent and accountable. He worked with his new leadership team to put in place systems that would prevent any future misuse of power. Every decision would be made with complete openness, and employees would have a voice in matters that affected their work and well-being. Slowly but surely, the company started to recover. The layoffs that had plagued the business in the past were a thing of the past. Instead of fearing for their jobs, employees started to feel secure, knowing that the company was finally operating in a way that respected them. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been a company on the brink of collapse had started to flourish again. James couldn't help but feel proud of what they had achieved. But there was a deeper understanding that settled in his mind. The battle for integrity and fairness in the workplace was never truly over. While he celebrated these early victories, a part of him couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more awaited on the horizon. As much as he had fought for the company's future, he knew that change wasn't a one-time effort. It was a continual process, and every day brought with it new challenges. He realized that the work of rebuilding wasn't just a corporate task, it was deeply personal. He had fought not just for the future of the company but for his own belief in fairness, in doing what was right. But along the way, he had lost something important, the ease of trust. James sat in his office one evening, looking over the reports, when he realized how much this journey had cost him personally. It wasn't just the people he had lost along the way, but the relationships that had been broken. He had always believed that his leadership would bring the company together. But in his pursuit of doing what was right, he had alienated himself from many who once stood by him. Still, He couldn't bring himself to regret the decisions he had made. They had been hard, and the isolation was real. But the company was stronger now. Employees were thriving, the culture was healthier, and there was a sense of trust returning. But for James, the victory still felt incomplete. There was something that gnawed at him, a lingering doubt that he had missed something crucial. In the weeks that followed, the company started to stabilize. Productivity soared, employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and the negative press that had plagued them for months began to fade. James knew that it wasn't just about the immediate changes, it was about the long-term impact these shifts would have. The foundation of fairness had been laid, and now the company had a chance to build on it, to be a beacon for others in the industry. But James was far from complacent. He knew that every success brought with it new challenges, and the road to sustained success would require more than just making it through the storms. One afternoon, as James was reviewing some old financial documents that had been overlooked in the frenzy of the investigation, he stumbled across something that caught his attention. A report, buried deep in the archives, contained details about secret transactions, deals that hadn't been fully accounted for in the earlier investigations. He skimmed through the pages, a sense of dread creeping up his spine as the truth began to sink in. The financial manipulations that had been exposed were just the tip of the iceberg. There were still hidden dealings within the company, involving a group of new investors who were already starting to gain significant influence. They had quietly been maneuvering behind the scenes, making moves that suggested a new power struggle was brewing. James's heart sank as he realized what this meant. The system had been reformed. Yes, but it had not been fully eradicated. The same forces that had once corrupted the company were now regaining strength, slipping under the radar with new tactics and allies. The battle that James thought was over had only just begun. A new chapter of his struggle was unfolding, one that would test everything he had worked for. The unsettling truth that a new faction was forming within the company hit James hard. As much as he had tried to protect the company and its future, the same cycle of power and manipulation was threatening to repeat itself. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but James knew he couldn't ignore it. The company was not out of the woods yet. Sitting back in his chair, James felt the weight of the new challenge bearing down on him. He had been through so much already, but the real fight was far from over. The system had changed, but its influence still lurked in the shadows. James had to make a choice. Would he continue fighting to create a truly just and transparent company? Or would he step back and let these forces rise again? The truth was, James didn't have an answer yet. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away now. The company, the employees, and his own conscience demanded that he continue the fight, no matter how long it took. As we've seen today, sometimes the truth can be hard to swallow, but it's essential for real change to happen. This story shows us how deeply the choices made at the top can impact the lives of those on the ground. It's a powerful reminder that we must always stay connected to the people we lead and not be afraid to face uncomfortable truths. So, what do you think? How far would you go to ensure fairness in your workplace? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind businesses and the lives of everyday workers, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths and stay tuned for more eye-opening revelations.